So please welcome our distinguished panelists, and some of them will sit and some of them may come to the podium. And welcome.
Thank you. And I want to express my gratitude to Professors Casey, Walsh, and Lee. It's nice to be back at my almost mater. I attended NYU for 2 years in the last millennium, but Professor Sexton is gone. We can talk about that later. I've entitled my short presentation this morning, Catholic Questions in the Early American Republic, and it's drawn from a larger book that I've been working on too long on popular, legal, and learned anti-popery, and then Catholic anti-Protestantism in the 18th and 19th centuries. The general narrative of the Catholic community in the United States is a narrative of oppression. The Catholics arrive, they're oppressed, they continue to be oppressed, the nativists make it worse, and then the miracle of the two Johns, the 23rd and John Kennedy in the 1960s, begins to change that story. While I'm not taking too much in objection to that, there's a different story to be told. 18th, 19th, and 20th century Catholics in the United States, nay, on both sides of the Atlantic, were also belligerents in a large debate over the legitimacy of liberal democracy, of freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. In the United States, American Catholics would be major forces arguing that, in fact, while the United States should stay liberal and democratic, it also should convert to Roman Catholicism, and American Protestants, by and large, objected to these positions. Let me then turn to my remarks. The American Revolution transformed the legal and political status of members of the tiny Roman Catholic community. It's about 1% of a population of 2.5 million, give or take, in 1775, 1776. Thank you. Okay. Fiat lux. Okay. Although fear of popery, say, for example, the Quebec Act, was among the causes of the rebellion, subsequent events would diminish the power of anti-popery in post-colonial America. In allying with France and Spain, and in redefining liberty in opposition to their British heritage, American Republicans moved anti-popery from the center to the margins of public life. When establishing new governments, they guaranteed freedom of conscience and worship to all citizens, and removed most disabilities on religious minorities. Though historians continue to argue over how radical the American Revolution might have been, it certainly was so for Romanists. Unlike their co-religionists in the British Isles, most particularly in Ireland, Catholics in the United States expected to enjoy equal rights. Yet the rhetoric of liberty and the realities of Americans' post-revolutionary religious settlement did not always correspond. Romanists were free to worship, to vote, to serve on juries and in the militia, but they were still barred from holding important elected positions in a majority of states. By the close of the 18th century, 2 of the original 13 states had removed such barriers. None that joined the Union after the Constitution would introduce them. However, restrictions remained in the better part of New England, in New Jersey, and in North Carolina, in some cases well into the 19th century. New Hampshire's Constitution bars Roman Catholics from serving as governor up to 1877 or 1878, and Rhode Island, which actually never had a constitution, they continued with their colonial charter, had on its books at least prohibitions against Catholics holding any office into the 20th century. Please don't tell that to anyone elected in Providence. In New York, the transition from papists to citizens that Professor Duncan has chronicled so well in his book came to an end in 1806 when Francis Cooper took his seat in the Assembly. But the continued presence of tests and oaths prompted laymen such as Philadelphia's Matthew Carey and clergymen such as John England of Charleston to suggest that a, quote, Catholic question, unquote, in America still remained to be settled. For those of you wondering about how this would square with the federal Constitution, both Section 3 of Article 4 and the First Amendment to the Constitution, those dealt solely with the federal government. Religious establishments continued in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, and I don't want to suggest here that these restrictions against Catholics holding office were solely directed against Catholics. They were directed against atheists, all 2 or 3 perhaps in the 18th century, Jews in a number of states, only Protestant Christians, and a number of states, Unitarians were barred as well. Theological and ecclesiological objections to Romanism also seem to have diminished, but not disappeared in the Revolution's wake. Despite the expectation of many, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison among them, that religious liberty would encourage social harmony and ecclesiastical convergence by removing the basis of strife. The separation of church and state opened new spaces for interconfessional confrontations. With these, appeals to reason replaced the legacies of legal coercion. Denominational competition, then, would produce more in the way of controversy than concord in the New Republic. Print and public disputes and debates between Protestants and Catholics began in 1784, when the Reverend Charles Wharton, a Maryland Jesuit who had embraced the Episcopal Church, or perhaps found true religion, published a letter to the Roman Catholics of the city of Worcester. In this text, Wharton explained his process of conversion and also urged his readers in England and the United States to consider the errors of popery and to embrace the truth of the Reformation. John Carroll, his first cousin and fellow Jesuit, who at that point was superior of missions in the new United States, answered with an address to the Roman Catholics of the United States in the same year. Carroll took pages from standard controversial manuals, went after his cousin point by point, and then pointed out the errors of Protestantism and the truths of Romanism. Wharton then responded with a reply to an address of the Roman Catholics in 1785. The tone of these exchanges was measured. It wasn't militant. Both Wharton and Carroll employed the tools and the text of learned anti-popery and anti-Protestantism. So too would subsequent controversialists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including another Jesuit, the Reverend Anthony Coleman. Although the court's decision in the People v. Phillips appears to have prompted no objections, I'll defer to Professor Walsh on this, but I can simply find no one in New York City in the wake of this who seems at all perturbed. The publication in 1813 of William Sampson's trial report did. The Catholic question in America included a 112-page appendix by Coleman entitled A True Exposition of the Doctrine of the Catholic Church, Touching the Sacrament of Penance. Coleman went through the articles of the Council of Trent, through the Church Fathers from Eusebius on, and through a number of standard 17th and 18th century Catholic manuals, including Richard Challoner's and John Gother's 18th century controversial pieces, and pretty well lined out what penance did. He, however, opened it with a short preface, and in that preface he would make an argument he had made previously and would continue to make. That is to say that Catholics in the United States, Protestants in the United States, had not embraced Catholicism due to the perfidies of Protestant ministers. If Catholic truth was made obvious to an American Protestant readership, they would embrace the true church. That they had not was due to what he would refer to as, quote, prejudice, unquote, and he sought to undo that prejudice with the publication of the Catholic Question. He then hoped to counter gross misrepresentations that prejudiced the minds of American Protestants with Catholic apologetics. The following year, Charles Wharton, once again, rejoined the ranks of controversy with a short answer to a true exposition of the doctrine, which presented standard Protestant arguments against the scriptural basis and the social consequences of confession. Wharton, the ex-Jesuit, was particularly incensed that Coleman would refer to Protestant ministers, like himself, being involved in misrepresentation. Wharton went through the standard Protestant positions against both penance as a sacrament, and then auricular confession as a practice. And as was standard for most Protestant texts, he moved from theological matters to social matters. Protestants would argue in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and into the 20th century that the social effects of penance and of auricular confession would be detrimental, and for Wharton, especially, to an American Republican citizenry. How so? Because by simply absolving people of sin, the priest in the confessional, in fact, was allowing crime, disorder, and subversion to go on and on and on. Wharton, of course, did not want to stop auricular confession legally as a practice, but Wharton was extremely concerned that, in fact, auricular confession would be accepted by Americans in general and not seen for the menace that he construed it as. A Charleston Catholic cleric, Simon Felix Gallagher, entered the fray in response to Wharton with a brief reply to the short answer of a true exposition in 1815. And once again, Gallagher, a Maynooth graduate actually, I think he's probably the first Maynooth man who makes an impression in the United States, also a professor at the College of Charleston. Gallagher would respond to Wharton with, once more, the standard Catholic answers to Protestants, and would argue, in fact, that auricular confession would have a beneficial, not a dangerous effect on American Republic audience. Wharton brought this opening episode of what would become a prolonged debate over the implications of auricular confession in America to an end in a text called Some Remarks on Dr. O'Gallagher's Brief Reply 2 years later. The Catholic question that engaged the Reverend Coleman, Wharton, Gallagher, and their readers was not about how suitable Romanists might be as subjects or citizens. Rather, it was about the ethical and moral implications of Catholic doctrine, discipline, and devotions in the new American Republic. This then was a theological, not a legal debate. We heard DeWitt Clinton last night referring to his decision in The People v. Phillips in terms of it being legal, not theological, but in fact, most Americans who would be aware of this case would follow it in the 18-teens and into the 1820s in theological, not legal terms. Yet by the early 1830s, the political and legal consequences of popery would once again emerge as a matter of contention, especially here in New York City. This is a subject perhaps for a future symposium. John Hughes, who would become Bishop and Archbishop of New York, would deliver an annual lecture on St. Patrick's Day, which he called the downfall of Protestantism, unquote, part of John Hughes's strong ecumenical outreach. I should note in closing that Coleman produced a satirical attack on Martin Luther during the tercentenary of the Reformation in 1817, and a more subsequent critique of Unitarianism when he was president of Georgetown in 1821. In 1824, he moved to Rome and a chair of theology at the Gregorian University. Among his students was Paul Cullen, who, as Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin, would promote an anti-Protestantism far more polemical than his professor's measured apologetics, and far less ecumenical than the United Irish Irenics of William Sampson. Thank you.